You've arrived at CozySideAudio, where dreams begin with a story. Whether you're studying, journaling, or just chilling, this one's for you. If you vibe with this kind of content, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe for more.
CozySideAudio presents Orbiting the Unknown. Chapter 1. Awakening in the Dark. When consciousness returned, it did not arrive all at once. It came in increments, a vague heaviness in his limbs, the sour bite of stale oxygen against his tongue, the dim suggestion of light spilling through a crack in the void. His eyelids fought him when he tried to lift them. The simple act of breathing felt like drawing air through a cloth soaked in rust. Somewhere close by, something ticked, a hollow sound, like metal contracting after heat. Then silence, then another tick. The astronaut lay still, counting the rhythm, afraid to move and discover why his body felt both too heavy and too light at once. For a while, he thought he was still in the capsule, descending into atmosphere. That had happened before the suffocating weight, the jarring confusion. But no. The pull of gravity was inconsistent here, a shiver of weight pressing him down, then easing, then pressing again. A half-dead gravity generator sputtering out its last reserves. When at last his eyes opened, he saw only red. Emergency lighting. A thin ribbon of illumination stretched across the ceiling of the compartment, broken by black gaps where panels had failed. The air was thick with the iron tang of oxidized blood, though whether it was his own or someone else's, he couldn't tell. He tried to move his hand. It obeyed, though sluggishly. His fingers brushed against the harness webbing cutting across his chest. He unclipped it one buckle at a time, each metallic snap echoing in the chamber. "Hello?" His voice was a stranger's rasp, too soft and raw. He coughed, pain blossoming sharp in his ribs. No one answered. He pulled himself free and drifted forward. The inertia carried him into a bulkhead, forehead first. His skin stung. Reflex brought his hands up. They met cold alloy smeared with something sticky. He pulled his fingers back and saw the glisten in the red light. Blood. The astronaut blinked and tried to summon a name, a word, any marker of identity that would tether him to himself. Nothing came, just silence, like the blank edge of a corrupted file. He was someone. He had been someone. But the data was gone. A low groan reverberated through the ship's structural, not alive. Somewhere, a pressure seal gave a warning moan. The voice of an old leviathan complaining its strain. The sound went on for a few seconds before fading. He twisted in the air, letting momentum carry him toward the hatch at the far end. The pressure door was partly ajar, teeth of the locking ring bent and warped. Beyond it, he glimpsed floating debris, papers, a fragment of broken glass, something darker drifting slowly, tumbling head over heels. A human arm. The astronaut froze. His chest seized. The arm was pale, sleeve scorched, fingers curled stiff. The rest of the body was lost in shadow. "Crew," he whispered. The word tasted uncertain, like a guess. He wasn't sure if it was true. The tick resumed. That same hollow contraction of metal. This time he realized it wasn't random. It came in steady intervals, almost like a metronome, almost like a clock. He pushed through the hatch. The corridor beyond was carnage. Panels hung open, wiring spilling out like veins. The air shimmered faintly with particles frozen droplets of coolant, maybe, or crystallized blood. He tried not to breathe too deeply, though the sour reek of rot was already impossible to ignore. There were bodies, 3 of them, floating, unmoored. Their faces were pale, some locked in silent screams, others collapsed into the stillness of death. His chest tightened. He drifted closer, hand trembling as he brushed against one shoulder. The corpse rotated lazily. A woman, eyes glassy, hair floating in a dark halo. And then, He heard her voice. Not aloud, not in the air, but inside his head. "You shouldn't be here." The astronaut recoiled, slamming into a bulkhead. His breath came ragged. He stared at her face, waiting for the lips to move. They didn't. She remained perfectly still, dead as anybody could be. Yet the echo of her words lingered in his mind. Not a hallucination, but a statement with weight, as if someone had leaned close to whisper. "No," he croaked. "No, that's not real. You shouldn't be here." The second repetition nearly broke him. He clamped his hands over his ears as if that could block it, but the sound was not sound. It was memory, or something, wearing the shape of memory. His own thoughts betrayed him with an image. This woman, alive, speaking on the bridge, laughing about some trivial matter. A memory he could not possibly have, because he did not remember her name, did not remember his own. Yet the memory was sharp, invasive. He pushed himself away, heart thundering, and floated deeper into the corridor. Minutes or hours passed as he stumbled through the wreckage of the ship. Emergency power hummed somewhere distant, unreliable. The pulse of the red lights gave the impression of being inside a wounded beast's rib cage. Each throb of illumination, a heartbeat. Aimed, he reached the observation deck almost by accident, drifting through an open hatch and colliding with a viewport. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it clear with the back of his hand and froze. Outside, a pulsar. It filled the void like a furious god's eye, blazing with beams of light that lanced across space in clockwork precision. Each rotation was impossibly fast, each sweep of radiation a scythe that bathed the ship in lethal brilliance. Only the shielding kept him alive, shielding that was visibly flickering, patches of auroral shimmer peeling away. The light painted his skin pale. The star's pulse seemed to reach into his chest, syncing with his heart. And then he realized the ticking he'd heard earlier matched the pulsar's rotation. Perfectly. Tick, pulse. Tick, pulse. Time itself beating against the hull. He retreated from the viewport, hands shaking. His mind swam with nausea, memory shards cutting through the fog. He saw glimpses the launch, the crew assembled, someone shouting in panic as alarms screamed, the ship shuddering as if torn through cloth. Then nothing. "Who am I?" His voice was hollow. "Who was I?" "You know who you are," whispered another voice, male this time, older, calm. The astronaut spun, searching. No one there, just another corpse tumbling gently in 0G, its eyeless sockets gazing past him into eternity. He pressed his palms against his skull and screamed until his throat burned. When he calmed, if the quivering breath could be called calm, he stumbled back toward the crew quarters. He needed answers. He needed a record. A personal locker had burst open in the decompression, its contents scattered. Among them he found a flight log, screen cracked, still faintly glowing. He pulled it free and powered it. Text scrolled across in fragmented bursts. Mission log 177. System failure. Crew status, unstable. Objective, corrupted. Note, corrupted. The log ended in static. His fingers twitched, trying to call up earlier entries, but the file system was shredded. He drifted back, clutching the useless device to his chest. The pulsar pulsed again. The ticking followed. And, beneath it, the voices murmured in his skull, faint, overlapping, indistinct. A chorus of the dead. The astronaut knew only one truth now. He was alive, alone, orbiting the unknown, and the ship was dying faster than he could save it. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Hull. The next time he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the crew quarters. He didn't remember how he had drifted here, the ship's central spine, where the longitudinal beams met like bones inside a rib cage. The corridor was tight, lined with access hatches. The red emergency lights flickered in waves, pulsing in imperfect sync with the star outside. Each stutter of illumination revealed a new arrangement of shadows, like something had shifted just out of sight. He clutched the wall and tried to steady his breathing. His lungs ached. Each inhale rasped like a saw through brittle wood. "You're not breathing right," said a voice. He froze. His gaze darted along the corridor. "You're pulling too shallow. You'll black out." It was a woman's voice, and it came from nowhere, from inside his skull again. It was the same woman whose corpse he had touched. He remembered her hair, haloed in zero gravity, her dead, glassy eyes. "Stop," he whispered, pressing his palm to his temple. "You always panicked," she said. The tone was casual, conversational, but it struck him with the intimacy of memory. "Before launches, you held your breath without realizing. I used to nudge you in the ribs. Do you remember that?" He didn't. Yet when she spoke, his chest constricted with the certainty of, yes, she's right. "No," he muttered. "That's not mine. That's you." The voice softened, almost tender. "But we're all you now." He flinched back from the wall, colliding with the opposite bulkhead. The vibration set something rattling in the pipes above, a loose connection knocking faintly like knuckles on a door. He forced himself onward, deeper along the spine of the ship. The compartments he passed were in ruin. A laboratory module torn apart by decompression. A hydroponics bay, the greenery shriveled into dust. A storage closet where loose bolts floated in little clouds, like shrapnel waiting to be inhaled. Each space whispered with echoes. The air wasn't still here. It carried breath-like drafts. His rational mind traced them back to circulation systems, half-operational fans. But the emotional part of him recoiled, certain someone was sighing against his neck. He drifted into the mess hall. The tables were still bolted to the deck, though one had come loose, floating at an angle. Food packets had ruptured in the chaos, spraying the walls with frozen crumbs of soy protein and nutrient gel. A mug rotated lazily, handle chipped. Two bodies here. One slumped against the far wall, head cocked unnaturally sideways. Another floated near the ceiling, tether strap twisted around one ankle. And when he looked at them, voices again. "Do you remember the toast we made?" He was the one who insisted on chess matches every night. You hated the smell of rehydrated eggs, but you never said it. Didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Fragments, tumbling through his mind like debris. None of it his, yet they fit too neatly. He gripped the edge of a bolted table and squeezed until his knuckles whitened. "You're not me," he hissed. Silence. For a blessed moment. Silence. Then, "Aren't we?" He tore himself out of the mess hall. The corridor narrowed until he reached another bulkhead, its locking wheel half broken. He wrenched it open, metal screeching, and floated through. The next compartment was darker. No red lights here, only the faint wash of radiation shielding glow. Dust motes drifted, catching what little luminescence there was. He flicked on a wrist lamp. The beam swept across control console's navigation systems. Most were fried, their panels cracked, displays spiderwebbed, but one still glowed faintly, a sliver of surviving data. He clamped himself to the seat, breath shuddering, and tapped the console awake. Lines of code scrolled across, corrupted, many unreadable. But among the noise, vessel, Calypso, mission, corrupted. Crew complement 12. Current status, 1 active. 1 active. Him. The screen flickered again, and a new line of text appeared without his input. "Are you sure?" His mouth went dry. "What?" The console blinked. Static scrawled. Then, "Crew, 12 active." He slammed the display. It shuddered, scrambled, then went dead. His own reflection stared back in the black glass, gaunt, eyes hollow, face mapped with veins he hadn't noticed before. And behind that reflection, for just a fraction of a second, another face looked out. A man, smiling faintly. He spun around. Nothing. Only empty air. But the laughter lingered. He drifted down to the engineering deck, pulse hammering. Here the air smelled different, acrid, sharp, like burned copper. Sparks floated from torn conduits. Somewhere coolant hissed, condensing into pale fog that wreathed the corridor. He stopped moving. There! A sound, distinct from the ship's groans. A scrape. Slow. Deliberate. His lamp beam cut across the mist. Nothing. Empty corridor, pipes and vents. The scrape again. Closer now. The astronaut gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The mist swallowed him. His light barely penetrated more than a meter ahead. Every instinct screamed that someone was walking parallel to him, matching pace, staying just beyond the glow. "Show yourself," he rasped. His voice cracked. No response. Only the hiss of coolant. But when he passed an intersection, something brushed his ankle. Not a cable, not debris. Fingers. He kicked away in a panic, spinning down the corridor, shoulders slamming into bulkhead, helmet scraping sparks. The mist thinned and he burst into a wider chamber, the reactor bay. The core still throbbed faintly, sickly light pulsating with uneven rhythm. Control rods misaligned, coolant flow reduced to trickles. The ship's heart was dying. And in the reflection of the core chamber glass, he saw them. Shapes. 12 of them. All standing in silence, their outlines wavering in the glow. He spun nothing, only empty chamber. But the reflections remained, arranged like an audience, watching. A voice cut through his mind, clear, male, calm. "You need to stop running." "Who are you?" the astronaut whispered. "We're you, all of us. Don't you understand?" His throat tightened. "No, you're dead." "Yes, and so are you." The reactor pulsed again, light dimming, shadows lengthening. "You just haven't accepted it yet." Chapter 3. The Dead Crew. He no longer tried to tell himself he was imagining it. The voices were there, whether hallucinations, ghosts, or some deeper violation of his brain. They had weight. They spoke with knowledge he did not have, with familiarity that pierced him. Every attempt to deny them only left him gasping in the hollow quiet afterward, waiting for the next intrusion. And the ship, the Calypso, offered no refuge. The astronaut forced himself along the spying corridor toward the crew manifest chamber. He remembered dimly that such a module existed, a memorial space built into long-haul ships, a concession to human frailty. In decades past, missions had faltered when crew were forced to eject bodies into space without closure. So the agency had mandated something new. A room to store the fallen, until return. He knew he would find them there. All of them. The hatch was stuck. He wedged fingers into the seam, heaved until his muscles quivered and felt the lock give. The door floated aside with a scraping sigh. He drifted in. Rows of compartments lined the walls, coffin-shaped pods, not all sealed. Some cracked open in the violence of whatever had happened. Inside, the crew. The astronaut counted them, throat constricting. 1, 2, 3, 11. Each strapped or sealed, some faces intact, others mangled by decompression. Frozen blood crystals sparkled faintly in the red light. He clutched a handhold and tried to breathe. 11, he whispered. The console had told him 12. That left him. Or someone else. He floated closer to one of the open pods. The woman he had first touched lay within, hair spread like black seaweed, skin waxen. His lamp caught the tag on her chest. Dr. Ilara Nadir, astrophysics. Her name jolted through him with the force of recognition. Ilara, he said aloud, though he had not known the word a moment before. The voice answered instantly, warm in his skull. That's right. You remembered. He shook his head violently, trying to expel her. No, you put that there. It was always there. You just needed a nudge. Her memory slid into him without permission. Images, her at the briefing table, eyes sharp, explaining pulsar dynamics with fierce clarity. Her laughter echoing in the mess hall, mug in hand. Her arguing with the captain over protocol. He saw himself in those fragments too, sitting across from her, nodding, replying. Except he couldn't feel that self. The version of him in the memory was hollow. A mask. Stop, he muttered, clutching his temples. You're not me. We are you now. You're carrying us. You have to. He pushed away from her pod, chest heaving. The next one read, Lieutenant Jace Morin, Security. His corpse floated stiff, eyes open, lips blue. And at once, check the lockers under Deck 9. You always forget. I told you we'd need spares. Another memory. Jace running drills, weapon at his hip, clapping him on the shoulder. Trust, brotherhood. He screamed into the chamber, voice ragged. Stop putting yourselves into me. Stop it. No answer, just silence. Then, softly, it's the only way you'll survive. He drifted down the line, unable to stop himself. Pod after pod, name after name. Each corpse bled into him. Annika Holst, medical. You panicked during your first EVA. I coached you through the breathing exercises. Ryu Takeda, engineering. Remember when we jury-rigged the coolant lines? You swore we'd never make it back, but I laughed in your face. Captain Hallstrom. You questioned me once. I respected you for it. Not many did. Each contact filled him with lives not his own. Their histories, their voices, their emotions. His skull felt crowded, a hive where he had once been alone. By the time he reached the final pod, his hands were trembling so violently, he could barely read the tag. Mira Cassian, pilot. Her body was gone, the pod empty. He stared, his mind reeled. And then, a whisper, intimate as breath in his ear. I'm not gone. I've been here the whole time. He spun, heart hammering. The chamber was empty except for the drifting corpses. His lamp caught nothing but steel and shadows. Mira? His voice cracked. No answer. But he knew. She was the missing one. And she wasn't in the pods because she wasn't entirely dead. The astronaut fled the chamber, clutching the handhold so hard his palm split skin. He didn't notice the blood floating in tiny globes around him. His thoughts were a snarl of overlapping voices. Ilara reminding him of orbital mechanics. Jace warning him about the lockers. Annika whispering reassurance. Ryu laughing in defiance. The captain commanding restraint. And beneath them all, like an undercurrent, Mira, silent, waiting. He forced himself into the comms room. The equipment was gutted, antennae burnt out, consoles smashed. Only fragments of the transmission array survived. But among the debris, he found the black box. It was scorched, casing half melted, but intact enough to blink green. He pulled it close, heart hammering. If there were answers, they were in here. He connected it to a half-working console, fingers shaking as he bypassed circuits. Static flooded the screen, then lines of text, corrupted but legible. Mission, Calypso 7. Objective, test FTL transit with pulsar gravitational assist. Status, failure. Crew, deceased. He scrolled further. Cause, corrupted. Notes, crew psychosis, hallucinations, suicidal behavior. Final entry, they're still here. The astronaut froze, staring. His breath hitched. And then, The voices in his skull all whispered at once, overlapping in a single deafening harmony. "Yes, we are." He reeled back from the console, heart jackhammering, throat raw. The black box flickered. New text appeared, not from the archive, but written now. "You aren't supposed to be alive." He staggered against the bulkhead. "I'm alive." The screen answered, "Prove it." His hand shook so violently he almost dropped the console. He shut it down, severing the connection. Silence fell again, broken only by the faint creak of the hull. But he could feel them. The crew, not only in his head now, but in his skin, in his marrow. His memories weren't whole anymore. He wasn't whole anymore. And in that silence, Mira's voice returned, steady, almost kind. "You'll have to choose soon, whether you're one of us or still only you." Chapter 4. Dead Voices. The voices began as whispers in the ventilation shafts. Kieran was halfway between a broken console and the smashed panel of the ship's medical bay when he first caught it. Low, uncertain syllables threading through the hum of the dying life support. He froze, hands hovering above the splintered casing, listening. "Kieran." A dry exhale of sound, his name unmistakable, but stripped of warmth. He turned slowly, helmet light washing across the chamber's wreckage. The med bay was a charnel house, corpses long desiccated in zero atmo months ago. He had counted them all. 4 here, 2 in engineering, another drifting in hydroponics. There should have been no one alive to say his name. But there it was again, closer this time. "Don't leave us." He stumbled backward into the wall. The rebreather rasped as though it, too, was struggling against the weight of sound. For a long moment, he shut his eyes and told himself it was nothing more than memory leakage, a hypoxic brain reeling under cosmic pressure. He had gone without proper oxygenation before. Hallucinations were not new territory. But these weren't phantasms conjured from within. They carried cadence, identity. He could tell, with awful certainty, whose voices these were. Nadia's. The pilot, sharp and impatient, even in death. Jules, the medical officer, slower, kind enough to wrap grief around syllables. And Liao, their navigator, forever punctuating sentences with the faintest laughter. All 3 gone, bodies accounted for. And yet, here they were, layering across the static and electrical hiss like the ship itself had become a grave that refused to close. Kieran gritted his teeth. "Not real," he whispered. "Not real, not—" But then they spoke back, overlapping, insistent. "We are real. We are you." By the time he staggered free of the med bay, the ship seemed smaller, its corridors closer. Every hatch carried the risk of another voice slithering out. He shoved himself through a ladder well, limbs clumsy in the thin gravity spin. The voices tracked him, calling from deck to deck. In the mess hall, they recited the last jokes they'd shared before systems collapsed. In the hydroponics, they whispered failures, warnings he hadn't heeded, calibrations he'd left to others. Every sound cut deeper than memory. They struck with the exactness of sensory recall. He could smell Jules's clove gum, hear the crack of Nadia's knuckles against a control panel, feel Liao's hand against his shoulder in that final hour. He could not have invented these things, not in such texture, not in such cruel detail. The ship itself seemed to carry them. The failing circuits hummed in sympathetic resonance, as though amplifying neural echoes. Sleep was impossible. He tried strapping into his quarters, but the compartment was already thick with whispers. Dreams, when they came, were worse. Scenes of the crew standing at the viewport, gazing down at the pulsing heart of the pulsar, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving in chorus. Join us in the orbit. He would wake with fingers clawing at his own throat, convinced they had sealed his helmet from the inside. On the fourth cycle, he discovered something worse than the whispers. The voices began to ask questions. Not the fragmented nonsense of delirium, but directed, coherent interrogation. Why did you leave me bleeding in the airlock? Jules. Why didn't you override navigation when you had the chance? Liao. Why are you alive, Kieran, and I'm not? Nadia. Each question struck like a hammer. He knew fragments of answers, but none would suffice. Guilt began to carve grooves through his chest. He replayed the last hours of the mission over and over, trying to discern if he truly had condemned them, or if survival had simply demanded decisions too fast for mercy. But the voices didn't wait for him to decide. They supplied their own verdict. You abandoned us. You let the ship die. You let us die. Kieran fought against it with engineering logic. He buried himself in the ship's remains, trying to drown the whispers with diagnostic screens and fractured power lines. He tore through circuit housings, forced himself to calculate the probability of restoring FTL, anything to root himself in equations that had nothing to do with ghosts. But the more he worked, the louder the voices became. They began to slip into his own thoughts, finishing his sentences. They remembered schematics he shouldn't have known by heart. They offered solutions before he arrived at them, speaking through him with uncanny precision. He realized, with cold horror, that they were not separate. They were inside him, braided into neural pathways like invasive root systems. The ship had imprinted them, perhaps in its failing moments. Some desperate attempt to salvage human cognition through recording, through transmission. Or perhaps the pulsar had scoured their minds into radiation echoes, weaving them into his. Whatever the cause, the result was absolute. He was no longer singular. One cycle, he caught himself answering aloud. Jules asked if he was tired, and he murmured back, always. Nadia cursed at a snapped circuit, and he snapped with her, their anger synchronous. By the next cycle, he wasn't sure where his voice ended and theirs began. The ship's log systems, half-functional, yielded fragments. A recording flickered to life, grainy with static. Nadia shouting over alarms. If we fall into the pulsar's cone, we're... Before the playback dissolved into noise. Another clip. Jules sobbing, breathless. Don't tell him, he doesn't need to. And then silence. Kieran leaned in, straining to catch what was lost, but the voices inside supplied the missing words. They spoke in chorus with the recording, filling gaps as though stitching reality together. It chilled him more than silence. They were reconstructing memory, writing history from within. By the time he sealed himself in engineering, he understood the truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't alone on this derelict, not in the way he'd once feared. He carried them with him. Every step, every intake of breath, every attempt at repair. They were dead, yes, but not gone. Their consciousness had threaded itself into his, bound by the orbit of this cursed pulsar. He was becoming less Kieran Halloran, astronaut, more vessel, repository, ghost ship incarnate. The pulsar beat outside the viewport, steady and eternal. And with each flash of its light, the voices surged louder, more insistent, more commanding. You will not leave us. You cannot leave us. We are you now. Kieran pressed his forehead to the cold alloy of the bulkhead and tried to remember what his own voice sounded like, unaccompanied. But he could not. Chapter 5. Signals in the Static. The hiss of static had become so constant that Elias almost forgot what silence was supposed to sound like. In the belly of the ship, tucked within the cramped communications array that stank of fried circuits and carbon scoring, he listened. The static wasn't empty. Nothing in this place was ever empty. Behind it were rhythms, half-suggested patterns, thready pulses that seemed to rise and vanish like a half-remembered dream. The pulsar outside set the metronome, its deadly lighthouse beam sweeping the derelict ship and drenching its hull in radioactive fury. And threaded through that drumbeat of cosmic energy was something else, something that didn't belong. At first, Elias told himself it was just the mind misfiring. Oxygen deprivation, hunger, the way grief clawed at his neurons until every squeal of interference sounded like a voice. He had already been hearing enough of them without the radio's help. "Listen closer," said Avery's voice, as though she were hunched beside him in the narrow comms alcove. Her hands clasped around her knees, her chin tilted toward the panel. Avery had been the comms officer, patient to a fault, with a habit of triple-checking every signal packet. Elias didn't even have to conjure her up. She came unbidden. "You're not imagining this." He leaned forward, straining against the harness. The ear set dug into his head, the hiss carving deep into his skull. Beneath it, yes, something, a ripple of sound. Not words exactly, not structured, but arranged, purposeful. "You hear it too, don't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to Avery. She didn't answer this time. The comms array was a wreck. Whole panels were blistered. The shielding burned through. The pulsar's endless wash of radiation had chewed every antenna until most of them were only stubs. But Elias had scavenged what he could, patching half-burned relays into working order, coupling wire with hand-spun solder until the whole thing looked less like a machine and more like a corpse kept alive by crude prosthetics. He told himself it was futile. There was no one left to call, no one within range. But still he worked, because the moment he stopped, the silence, the wrong kind of silence, the silence of no longer existing, would fall in and crush him. And now the static was different. He kept the volume low, unwilling to draw the attention of the other voices. They weren't always active, but when they were, they pressed against him with an intensity that stole his breath. He'd learned quickly that engaging them too much blurred the line further. Better to leave them muttering in the background of his skull, fragments of people who no longer had throats or lungs. But tonight, if time could still be called that, the voices were replaced by something external, a pattern. Da-da-da. He blinked. His heart punched against his ribs. That wasn't nothing. That was a cadence. He counted the spaces, jotted them down in grease pencil across the armrest of the comms seat. Dot, dot, dash, 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 Morse. It had been decades since anyone used it, but training had drilled it into his head like scripture. "Help!" The word was crude, distorted by interference, but it was there. Someone, or something, was saying it. He tore off the headset, breath ragged. Sweat clung to his temples. Impossible. The Halcyon had been alone. Every member of the crew accounted for. Dead. Their suits and tags confirmed it. No auxiliary craft remained intact. And beyond the ship's orbit stretched the black desert, the pulsar's fury sterilizing everything within reach. There couldn't be another soul out here. Yet the word pulsed through the console again. "Help." "Don't," whispered another voice. This one in his own head, female, clipped, impatient. Dr. Marquez, the ship's medic, who had never tolerated superstition or comfort when raw truth would do. "You want to survive. You ignore that. It's bait. Noise shaped to make you lean closer." His knuckles whitened against the panel. "I heard it. It was real." "No," Marquez said, calm as ice. "It was designed." For hours, if the ship's clocks were still meaningful, he stayed there, bent over the ruined comms rig, coaxing clarity from the static, adjusting filters, recalibrating burnt coils. Every motion felt like building a raft from splinters in the middle of a storm. Yet the signal persisted, garbled, uneven, but undeniably intentional. Other fragments came through now. Alive. Trapped. Elias. His name. The sound of it stripped him raw. The voices in his head never bothered with names. They didn't need to. They were him or he was them. But this was external, broadcast into the dead vacuum, captured by half-melted receivers. He staggered back from the console, chest heaving. Someone out there knew his name. "Don't answer it." Avery's ghost again, closer this time, almost warm against his shoulder. "If you do, it won't stop. You'll never know what's yours and what's the dark bleeding through. But if it's real, then you're already too late to save them." Sleep, or the simulation of it, was out of reach. He drifted the corridors in a haze, the ship creaking around him like some hollow carcass left to orbit until entropy swallowed it. Always, the pulsar roared beyond the hull, an invisible storm stripping molecules from existence. The halcyon's shielding groaned against it, failing one atom at a time. The voices followed him. "We were meant to die out here," whispered Brooks, the navigator, who had once been Elias's closest confidant. "You remember, don't you? That was the real mission. Exploration was just the excuse." "Lies," Elias muttered. "That's just me thinking. That's all." But Brooks chuckled, a dry sound echoing inside his skull. "If it were only you, you wouldn't argue back." By the time he returned to the comms array, something in him had cracked. He didn't want to admit how desperate he was for something outside his own skull, something that proved the universe hadn't folded entirely inward. He strapped in, hands trembling, and let the headset settle again. The static came, then the pulses. Clearer this time, louder. "Help! Elias, help! Where are you?" His voice rasped against the mic before he realized he'd engaged it. The reply was warped, crushed by interference. But it came. A voice not belonging to anyone he knew. Not Avery, not Marquez, not Brooks. Human, but shredded by distance. "We're close. Ship torn. Please." His throat tightened. "There's no way. There's nothing within reach of this pulsar. Nothing could have survived here." "Survived," the voice repeated, glitching into silence. And then the comms bay went black. Every panel died at once, leaving only the ultraviolet blink of the emergency diode. The hum of air recyclers sputtered, then steadied. A new noise joined it, the faint scrape of movement down the corridor. He froze, headset still clamped to his ears. Not in his head, not from the comms. Real. On the ship. He pulled himself from the chair, every muscle wired tight, and reached for the nearest tool, a length of carbon piping from a dismantled coolant shaft. His heart stuttered as he stepped into the corridor. The scrape came again, metal on metal, too deliberate for random settling. "Brooks?" The word cracked from his throat, absurd even as it left him. No answer. He advanced slowly. The emergency diode behind him painted long shadows, stretching like talons down the corridor. His breath misted in the chill. At the far end, something shifted. A silhouette against the emergency glow, slight, uneven. Elias's gut turned to ice, because the figure was familiar. Avery. Suit half shredded, hair drifting weightless around her face. Eyes wide, but not seeing. Her lips parted. And in his headset, perfectly synced with the motion of her mouth, the signal repeated. "Help! Elias, help!" He didn't remember dropping the pipe. He didn't remember stumbling backward into the comms bay, clawing for the hatch. The only clear thought he had, as the hatch sealed and his lungs burned against the recycled air, was this. There was a signal. Real or not, it wanted him, needed him. And whether it was a trap or salvation, he no longer had the strength to resist listening. Chapter 6. The Silent Observatory. He drifted along the broken spine of the ship, trailing his hand along walls that no longer had meaning. Every surface felt brittle, emptied of warmth, the kind of cold that wasn't merely absence of heat, but the negation of life itself. Somewhere behind the rattling of his breath, the ship made a low, periodic groan, as if reminding him it was still holding together against every reason it shouldn't. The observatory lay at the far end of the vessel. Once it had been a place of study and wonder, a domed chamber for gathering data from the pulsar's emissions, for gazing at the interstellar abyss with instruments far sharper than the human eye. Now, as he reached its access hatch, he was struck with the memory of how proud they had all been when it was installed. He remembered Dr. Miles clapping him on the back, joking about how he'd never find a better view in the galaxy. But Miles was gone, broken and scattered, and what remained of him pressed faintly at the edges of Kieran's mind. Another voice, trying to be heard. The hatch resisted at first, its locking mechanism unresponsive. He tried overriding it from the keypad, fingers clumsy against the half-lit interface, but it flickered without giving. For a moment, he thought he might have to abandon the attempt. Then the voices returned. Pull the panel, manual release. It was Quinn this time, steady and insistent. Her tone had always been that way, like someone who could distill panic into clarity. He pressed his palms against the hatch frame, searching. Sure enough, beneath a warped plate of alloy was the manual override lever, stiff from lack of use. He yanked it down, and the door unsealed with a reluctant hiss. A wash of stale air hit his faceplate, faintly tinged with char. The observatory greeted him with a silence so profound it seemed alive. Half the transparent dome was fractured, covered with a patchwork of emergency shutters that filtered the pulsar's furious glare into bands of ghostly light. Dust floated like plankton in water, slow, luminous motes illuminated by the rotating beam of the neutron star. Kieran stepped inside, boots magnetizing weakly against the deck. The room felt larger than he remembered, emptied of purpose, the consoles either dark or frozen in mid-function, data streams halted in time. He glanced toward the main station where Miles had once worked tirelessly, parsing streams of radiation data. Now, only fragments of half-completed analysis clung to the displays like fossils. A whisper threaded through him. Miles knew. He was trying to tell us something before it happened. He couldn't separate whether the thought belonged to him or to the ghost lodged in his mind. He moved closer to the central console, brushing away a thin film of dust. The interface sputtered to life under his touch, though its resolution was degraded, pixels swimming like oil on the water. Lines of code and radiation graphs scrolled briefly, then froze again. Beneath the static, he caught a phrase, repeated as though etched into the system's dying memory. Signal anomaly detected. He leaned in, pulse quickening. Signal anomaly? From where? He whispered to himself, though perhaps the others heard. The pulsar roared silently beyond the cracked dome, its rotation beaming like the heartbeat of some indifferent titan. Its light swept across the observatory in rhythm, turning shadows into blades. The console flickered again, a corrupted playback file trying to initiate. He tapped the screen. For a moment, audio bled through a distorted, broken voice. Kieran, if you're not stable. The radiations, don't trust the... Then silence. The pulse of the star filled the void. He pressed his palms against the console, forcing a command sequence. Static hissed, then snapped into an image. Miles, gaunt and pale, speaking directly into the recorder. His eyes had the glassy sheen of someone standing too close to madness. If anyone finds this, the pulsar isn't natural, or it isn't alone. There's something beneath the noise, a structured pattern. I don't know if it's communication, or if it's just the universe playing tricks on us. But it changes when you look at it too long. The others can't hear it, but The recording cut to black. Kieran staggered back. His breath fogged his helmet, hands trembling against the railing. 1,000 doubts collided in his head. Was this real? Or just another phantom stitched together from failing neurons and creeping radiation? The voices came louder now, overlapping. You can't trust it. You must listen. It killed us. It's calling us home. He dropped to his knees, clutching his helmet, trying to shut them out. The deck hummed beneath him, resonating faintly with each sweep of the pulsar's beam. Through the fractured dome, the pulsar's light burned, cold and merciless. For the first time since awakening, Kieran felt certain whatever killed his crew wasn't finished with him. And it was waiting. Chapter 7. The Rift in the Hull. The ship had been groaning for hours. At first it was background noise, the deep, skeletal creaks of a vessel that had been orbiting a gravity monster for far too long. But something had shifted. The sound wasn't just steel fatigue anymore. It was a new register, higher, more urgent, as if the ship itself was trying to warn him. Kieran lay awake in the crew quarters, strapped into his bunk, eyes tracing the jagged hairline fractures in the ceiling insulation. He didn't bother closing his eyes anymore. Each time he did, he saw them, his crewmates, standing at the edges of memory, sometimes silent, sometimes whispering. Dr. Mbeki would hum an old Nigerian hymn. Rena would tell him to tighten his grip, and Ivers, the engineer, always sounded furious, like Kieran had let something slip past him. It's not the pulsar. It's the hull. Get up, before it shears away. That was Ivers again, the voice sharp and insistent. The hallucination carried authority, a remnant of memory stitched into his brain. He wanted to dismiss it. He'd been hearing phantom orders since awakening, but then the ship moaned again and Kieran realized the voice wasn't wrong. Something was happening to the outer plates. He unbuckled himself, drifted into the corridor, and pushed toward the observation blister near Section D. The ship resisted him, its corridors alive with floating debris, condensation pearls breaking away from vents like tiny planets. His flashlight caught the frost crawling along the wall seams. Something was bleeding atmosphere. He stopped at a bulkhead, fingers brushing the pressure gauge inset in the wall. The needle was down, only slightly, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. A loss of pressure meant a breach. Not total collapse, not yet, but a wound. He couldn't let it grow. The memory hit him before he even touched the manual release. Rena's laughter, the echo of her voice in this very corridor. She had drifted here once, practicing her mid-flight flips, the same day they'd received the mission's final course adjustment. He could almost see her shape reflected in the viewport. She turned her head toward him, the phantom smile vanishing. "You weren't supposed to wake up," she said. Kieran shut his eyes and braced against the bulkhead. He didn't answer her. He had stopped answering days ago. The rift wasn't obvious at first. It never was, not when you were orbiting something like the pulsar. Radiation storms had pitted the hull. Micrometeorites had scored its surface. But this was different. Through the blister he saw it, a fracture running along one of the outer plates near the cargo spine. A shimmering halo of particles leaked into space, sparkling silver against the abyss. The ship's skin was splitting like brittle porcelain. If it gave way entirely, the vacuum would eat through compartments in minutes. He tapped the controls on the blister console. Most screens were dark, but one flickered reluctantly to life, a grainy schematic of the hull. Red traced the fault line. Section D was compromised. Not catastrophic yet, but time was thin. "You're not going to fix that," Ivers said in his skull. "You don't even remember half the systems." Kieran ignored him. He forced himself to study the diagram, every detail of the fracture line. He'd done extravehicular repairs before. He remembered flashes, the tug of the umbilical, the harsh bite of starlight against his visor. He'd never been good at it, though. Rena had teased him relentlessly, calling him 2 left gloves. But she wasn't here. None of them were. He would have to try. Preparation took hours. First, he hunted down the EVA suit, mag-sealed in one of the lockers in Section C. The helmet bore scratches, the kind that made you think about how fragile it all was, how the difference between life and vacuum was thinner than a fingernail. He checked seals, checked oxygen. The tank wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. Enough for one excursion. Maybe. Second, he rigged the repair kit. The adhesive patches were old, the plasma cutter temperamental, and the emergency resin cartridges half expired. He didn't care. A bad patch was better than no patch. Last, he recorded a message. Not a log entry, something simpler. He floated before the comms console, switched it on, and spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. "This is Kieran Vale, crew of the Calypso. Attempting repair outside Section D. If I don't make it back, this ship's dead weight anyway." He didn't finish the thought. He let the recorder die. The airlock hissed, a sound so final it made his chest ache. Beyond it was nothing, a silence older than anything he could imagine. The pulsar burned in the distance, a lighthouse of fury, its beams sweeping in terrible precision. Each pulse bathed him in ghostlight, a reminder that time itself was thinning, ground down by that cosmic clock. Kieran stepped out. The tether tugged against his waist, reminding him of his fragility. He pushed along the hull, boots magnetized with each careful step. The surface was rough beneath him, pitted with the history of their orbit. He was a shadow crawling over a corpse. The fracture loomed soon enough, a yawning scar across the plating, edges feathered with frost where atmosphere bled slow and steady. He pressed one glove to it. The vibration traveled up his arm, a dull tremor. The ship was breathing its last. He opened the kit, hands clumsy in thick gloves. Adhesive sheet, tear, apply. Resin, inject along the seam. Plasma torch, seal the edges. He worked methodically, muttering under his breath, counting steps like prayer. That's when the voices returned. Not whispers, not faint, but full, vivid, echoing inside the helmet. "Don't bother." That was Rena again, but angrier this time. "You think patching steel will save you? We're already gone." "Seal it tighter," Ivers barked, as if he were still alive and commanding him. "You're sloppy, always were. That resin will shear under the next rotation." "Kieran," came Dr. Mbeki's soft tone, a balm against the others. "It's not about the hull. It's about what waits when you stop fighting." He froze, resin tube hovering in his grip. The voices weren't muffled hallucinations anymore. They were layered, immediate, like a chorus using his suit comms as conduit. His breath fogged the visor, heart hammering. "No," he said, "not yet." He jammed the resin into the fracture, let it hiss into the void. White fog crystallized as it touched vacuum. The ship groaned again, a tremor running through the hull. He thought it might buckle beneath him. He forced the plasma torch alive, heat searing against frost, welding patched to steel. Minutes bled into hours. He lost track. The pulsar's light scythed across him, rhythmic, eternal. When he finally slumped back, the rift was sealed. Imperfectly, yes, but sealed. He had given the ship a little more time. Back inside, he collapsed in the corridor. Helmet still on, lungs burning. Sweat clung to his skin in cold beads. The voices were quiet again, retreated, or perhaps waiting. He didn't care. He staggered to the comms console and checked pressure readings. Stable, for now. The ship was holding. But something else had changed. The schematic flickered, and in its ghostly light he saw a new error warning. Not read along the hull, but deep within the ship, near the reactor spine. A warning he hadn't seen before. one that chilled him more than the vacuum ever could. Reactor instability. Critical threshold approaching. He stared at the message until his vision blurred. He had sealed one wound, but the ship was dying from the inside. And, for the first time, he wondered if the voices were right. Chapter 8. Flicker of the pulsar. The pulsar was patient. It always had been. A lighthouse beyond reason, sweeping its beam across dead worlds, abandoned stations, wreckage of missions that had run too close to its maw. But patience was not kindness. It was indifference, cold and absolute. Oren floated at the observation blister, suit gloves pressed against the fractured transparency that separated him from annihilation. He watched the star's heartbeat, that impossible rhythm that bathed the hull in intermittent blue fire. Each flash carved sharp shadows across the interior, throwing skeletal girders into relief, hollowing out the faces of the dead where they still lingered, tied to restraints, eyes long desiccated. But he wasn't truly alone. "You're wasting oxygen, Oren." The voice was Rhea's this time, stern but tired. His former captain had always been economical with words, economical with everything. In life, it had been reassuring, grounding. Now, as an echo worming through his skull, it only sharpened the isolation. Oren closed his eyes, but the image of Reyes persisted, rising unbidden behind his lids. The man hunched at a console, sleeve rolled up, the tattoo of a broken compass etched into his forearm. He remembered how that tattoo had shifted as Reyes moved his hands, the compass splitting wider when he flexed. It was absurd that such details clung to him now, absurd that memory had become a form of haunting. "I'm not wasting oxygen," Oren murmured. His voice sounded smaller inside the helmet. "I'm orienting." "Toward what? You know the trajectory. You've run the sims. The ship is half a cadaver. You don't have the thrust. Even if you manage to line up escape burn, the reserves won't hold." Oren exhaled, a sharp cloud fogging his visor. The pulsar flared again, the flicker illuminating the words he'd scrawled against the inner hull days ago. Notes to himself, calculations, equations that no longer looked entirely familiar. Some were his handwriting. Some were not. He pushed off the blister, floating down the central spine. His mag boots clamped down when he needed them, detached when he drifted. The dead were still there, of course. He tried not to look at them. But one did not ignore a crew forever. He stopped at the medbay hatch. It had been sealed since the beginning, since he first awakened to stench and silence. But something about the pulsar's flicker tonight pushed him here. A compulsion. Perhaps it was madness, but the line between compulsion and reason had eroded weeks ago. The hatch resisted when he forced it. It had been warped in some impact or simply jammed by neglect. His gloves slipped, then caught again. With one final wrench it yielded, the seal cracking with a sigh. Inside, the medbay stank of rot, even through filters. There were 3 bodies strapped to cots. 2 he recognized instantly, Tsao and Llewellyn. The third was unstrapped, twisted halfway onto the floor, her hair drifting in clotted strands. Dr. Salazar. Her eyes were open, her lips parted. "We warned you." The voice was not singular this time. It was a chorus, tangled and indistinct, male and female, overlapping. It reverberated in his jaw, in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. Oren staggered back, helmet clanging against bulkhead. He caught himself, palms pressed flat against the medbay wall. His suit's oxygen warning pinged faintly, like a bell far away. The chorus spoke again. "It wasn't the pulsar that killed us." He fled the medbay. Not a controlled withdrawal. He fled, pushing off walls, bouncing down corridors, refusing to look over his shoulder even though nothing followed. Or rather, everything followed. Voices, footsteps, memories of laughter in the mess, arguments at the helm, shared silences in the blister. They bled together, chasing him into engineering. He slammed the hatch closed behind him, chest heaving. Engineering had become his sanctuary. The fusion drives loomed around him like ancient gods, silent and slumbering, but still monumental. He pressed his forehead against cold conduit. He tried to slow his breathing. He tried to hear only himself. But then came the flicker again. The pulsar reached into the compartment through every fracture, every seam of transparency. The blue-white light strobed against machinery, giving the illusion of movement, as if something vast and insectile stirred just out of sync with the pulse. Oren raised his head. His reflection shimmered faintly in a panel. But it wasn't only his reflection. Reyes stood behind him. No, not stood. He hung, as though still in microgravity, head tilted, eyes two pits of collapsed light. His lips moved. It's not the pulsar. It's the interval. The silence between beats. That's where it got in. Oren screamed and struck the panel. His gauntlet cracked the casing, sparks bursting across the compartment. The reflection shattered, leaving only himself, gasping, trembling. Not real, he whispered. Not real. You're gone. You're all gone. But memory was as real as matter when the mind had no tether, and his tethers were unraveling. He staggered to the console, forcing his gloves across input pads, checking thrust readouts, life support, anything that still held numbers instead of phantoms. Numbers could not lie. Except these did. The propellant readout had been steady, 3%, always 3, yet now it flickered. 2.9, then back to 3, then 2.8. As though the ship itself were breathing. The voices quieted, just for a moment. He realized that was worse. Silence in the aftermath of hallucination felt like the pause before a blade. The pulsar flared again. The ship trembled as though responding. And Oren understood with sudden clarity. The ship wasn't derelict. Not completely. Something else was keeping it alive, or half alive, long past what engineering should allow. Some parasite, some presence synchronized with the strobing of the pulsar. That was why the dead were not silent, why memories spilled through him like infection. Not ghosts, not madness, not entirely. Something had moved in. Something that thrived in intervals between light. He shut the console down. He couldn't look at it anymore. His breath rasped loud in his helmet, drowning out even the faint ping of oxygen warnings. He whispered into the dark, not sure if he was speaking to himself, to his crewmates, or to something else. What are you? And the silence that followed was not silence at all. It was listening. Chapter 9. The signal from the pulsar. He had stopped sleeping. Or, rather, sleep no longer functioned as he remembered it. When his body succumbed, it wasn't rest. It was disassembly. A collection of flickering sensations replayed against his eyelids, some from his own life, some from the lives of others. He would wake with the knowledge of things he shouldn't know. May's childhood on the coast of Qingdao, Patel's first glimpse of Earth from orbit, Torres humming a hymn her grandmother had sung while she prepared lentils in a cramped apartment. They threaded into him like stray wires twisted into a circuit not built for them. The ship was quieter now. The groaning bulkheads still flexed under the strain of the pulsar's gravity, but the haunting creaks had faded into background rhythm. He had stopped jumping at them. He had started timing his breath against the spin of the pulsar, as if syncing his body to that alien metronome would keep him tethered. It was during one such breath, inhale, exhale, heartbeat, that he first noticed the pulse was no longer just radiation. A pattern. At first it might have been wishful thinking, a desperate brain seeing order in noise, but as hours stretched on, He became certain. Each flare, each spike of radiation flooding the hull, carried structure. Regular gaps, modulated sequences, subtle rises that mirrored the cadence of language. It wasn't Morse, not exactly. But it was something. "Do you hear it?" The voice was Torres again, whispering just behind his shoulder. "Do you hear the hymn?" "No," he rasped, throat dry from recycled air. "It's numbers." But later, when the next rotation brought its flare, he swore he could hear it as melody. 5 notes rising, 2 falling, like a lullaby translated into X-ray death. He spent the next day rerouting the ship's decaying sensor grid. The AI core still refused to answer queries. Whatever fragments had survived the pulsar's lash were inert. He had to improvise. He patched the comm dish directly into the radiation monitors, forcing a crude synthesis. The noise bled into his ears as a hiss, then, when he filtered, resolved into something terrifyingly deliberate. Someone, or something, was speaking through the pulsar. The crew didn't agree. "They're echoes," Patel insisted. His voice this time was clipped, impatient, as though the doctor had grown weary of being trapped inside the astronaut's skull. "The radiation is frying what's left of your perception. Synesthesia, hallucination, you want meaning, so you fabricate it." "No," May countered, her tone firm, almost defiant. "We looked for signals from pulsars back in training. Natural structure, yes, but never like this. He's right, it's language. It's trying to say something." "It's not for us," Torres murmured, softer now. "It was never for us." The astronaut pressed his palms into his eyes until stars erupted in the darkness. He wanted them gone, wanted to silence the jury in his skull. But the pulses continued, indifferent to his torment. When he could focus again, he began mapping. He marked each peak, each trough. Hours of labor with a shaking stylus on a scrap of plastifilm scavenged from the med bay. At first it was chaos, but slowly, terribly, patterns emerged. 3 repeating sequences, each a block of 23 intervals. Within those blocks, substructures. He recognized prime numbers. Then geometric ratios. 3, 4, 5, 12. It was communication encoded not in words, but in the scaffolding of mathematics, the universal grammar. Something out there was counting, waiting, speaking, and it was directed at him. The ship seemed to shrink as he realized it. Corridors became throat-like passages. The bridge was a skull with its eyes torn out. He couldn't move without feeling observed, pinned beneath the gaze of the pulsar. At the next rotation, when the flare hit, he shouted into the static, "What do you want?" The reply came not as sound, but as rupture in his body, bones thrumming, skin tingling with charged particles. The signal hammered through him, and for an instant he saw beyond, an ocean of frozen light, the pulsar suspended at its center like a wound in time, bleeding messages into infinity. Then it was gone, and he was slumped against the console, breath ragged. The voices of the crew were silent for the first time in days. He couldn't keep it to himself. If it was real, if the pulsar was transmitting, then even a sliver of the data could matter. Humanity had searched for proof of the other for centuries, and here it was, thrumming against his bones in murderous waves. He rerouted power from life support, dimming the lights until the ship resembled a mausoleum. The comm array flared reluctantly to life, sending compressed packets of his recordings outward. The pulsar might burn him to dust, but its song would not die with him. Hours later, he realized the risk. If the pulsar was a transmitter, it was not meant for him. He had become an interloper, intercepting signals not addressed to humanity. What if by replying, he had announced himself? And what if the voices in his head, the fragments of May, Patel, Torres, were not simply memory, but reflections of that same signal restructured into forms he could grasp? What if the crew had never truly been here at all? The next pulse nearly split him in two. He collapsed, blood in his mouth, as the radiation spike overloaded the sensors. When his vision cleared, the plastifilm map was gone, burnt black. But etched into his skull was the answer. The sequence had resolved, its meaning simple and horrifying. "Come closer." For a long time, he sat in the dark. He could drift away, power down the dish, pretend it was all noise, try to patch life support, cling to survival a little longer. But the thought clawed at him. If he ignored the signal, he was discarding humanity's first contact. If he followed it, obeyed, it might end him. He asked the crew, or the echoes of them. None replied. The silence was worse than their judgment. So he rose, legs trembling, and set a new course. Thrusters flared weakly, but the trajectory adjusted. The derelict slid incrementally closer to the pulsar's murderous light. The hull creaked in protest. His skin prickled. Somewhere deep within, he felt the crew stir again, restless, waiting. And through the static, through the bone-deep thrum, the voice of the pulsar whispered, not in math, not in music, but in something he recognized instantly, with dread that hollowed him out. His own voice saying, "You're almost here." Chapter 10. The Drift. The ship drifted. Not aimlessly, nothing in orbit ever was, but to Anton it felt as though Erebus had become a coffin cast loose into a tide no one could predict. The pulsar beyond still flung its lethal light in staccato bursts, a heartbeat of annihilation that reminded him, every 13 seconds, how little time meant when measured against such forces. The derelict vessel trembled as though the pulses themselves rattled through its ribs. Anton floated in the observation bay, staring through the fractured shield. The stars bled around the pulsar's corona, smeared by his failing eyes or by the distortion of warped glass. He couldn't tell which anymore. Behind him, the silence of the crew weighed heavier than the vacuum. It was never truly silent. Fragments of them lingered, voices half-formed, memories like whispers etched into the ship's surfaces. They rose when he tried to quiet his mind, intrusive, like static between radio stations. "Anton." Zhenya's voice crackled in him, more echo than sound. "Why are you still fighting?" He touched the rail, grounding himself. "Because you're all gone, and I'm not yet. You think survival is something you choose?" Another voice, Harlan, thick with disapproval. "We were chosen long before this, the ship, the pulsar, the mission. It was written." Anton shook his head. Their voices weren't real. He told himself this daily, hourly. They were bleed-throughs from memory, from trauma, maybe from hypoxia gnawing at his brain. But when he closed his eyes, he felt their breaths, smelled their sweat, remembered the warmth of their hands on console switches. Too vivid to be invention. He pushed from the rail, drifting back toward engineering. The core of Erebus was growing unstable. The damage from the reactor incident had been partially contained, but cracks ran deeper than Anton could repair alone. He floated past panels, each one blinking with demands he could not fulfill. Coolant redistribution, shielding integrity, oxygen reclamation. Each system limped. Together, they formed a symphony of failure. In the aft corridor, frost rimed the edges of the bulkhead, creeping like veins. Anton brushed his gloved fingers across it. Ice formed inside despite sealed hatches. Heat loss was accelerating. The ship was bleeding its warmth into the void. His bones ached from the cold, even through the suit's insulation. "You'll freeze before you starve," muttered Zhenya, her ghost following him. Anton ignored her. He activated the console near the reactor containment. The readouts flickered, refusing coherence. He slammed the side, and for a moment they resolved. Reactor output, 12% nominal. Coolant circulation, compromised. Structural strain, critical. He leaned in. Somewhere deep in the ship, the reactor throbbed like a dying heart. He imagined it rupturing, bathing him in radiation, reducing everything to silence, a clean end. But then came Lyra's voice, softer than the rest, almost kind. "You promised you'd bring us home." Anton squeezed his eyes shut. She had said that once, in life, her hand on his shoulder after the first skirmish with the pulsar's radiation storms. Her faith had been unshakable, and now, even dead, she chained him with it. Days, or what he thought of as days, bled into each other. Without reliable clocks, time fractured. The pulsar's relentless flashing marked intervals, but those could be minutes or hours depending on how his mind tracked them. He drifted through the ship, patching leaks, sealing conduits, rationing power. Oxygen levels continued to fall. He avoided the med bay. Too many bodies. He had sealed them there after the accident, promising himself he'd return to bury them properly, or vent them, whatever counted as burial in orbit. But he couldn't. He feared opening the hatch and finding them seated upright, waiting for him. Instead, he carried their voices. They grew sharper. They argued with each other, sometimes ignoring him entirely. He heard fragments of old conversations, mission briefings, laughter over shared meals, debates about orbital mechanics. At times, he caught them whispering things he had never known, private confessions. Harlan again. He'll crack. He was never meant for command. Zhenya. He'll last longer than you think. He's stubborn. Lyra. He's afraid of us, but he'll never leave us behind. Anton snarled at the empty corridor. "Shut up!" His voice cracked in his helmet, reverberating against the glass. Silence fell briefly. Then laughter, dry, hollow, rose from the air ducts. He kicked off the bulkhead and fled down the passage like a man chased. In the cargo hold, he discovered something new. The drift had carried Erebus into a debris field, fragments of their own ship perhaps, or remnants of another. He wasn't sure when it had appeared outside the porthole. Time blurred too much. Shards of metal, twisted and frozen, orbited alongside them. Some still bore scorch marks, scars of fire and pressure. Others were clean breaks, as though torn apart by invisible hands. Anton suited up and tethered himself, stepping into the airlock. The void greeted him with its cold indifference. He pulled himself hand over hand along the tether, approaching one of the larger fragments. It was a section of hull, jagged-edged, tumbling slowly. His helmet lamp caught something scratched across the surface. Letters, not from tools, but gouged by hand. Still here. His breath hitched. He spun, scanning the field. Other fragments floated by, and he saw marks on them too. Desperate scratches, messages left behind. "Don't sleep. Remember us. Join us." He pulled back sharply, tether straining. The debris rotated lazily, uncaring. But the voices cheered. "Finally," Zhenya hissed. "You've seen what we left you?" "You were blind before," Harlan said. Lyra whispered, "Come with us. Stop resisting. Stop drifting alone." He scrambled back into the airlock, slamming the inner hatch closed. His hands shook as he stripped the helmet off. Breath rasped in and out. He didn't believe it. Couldn't. The crew had died inside the ship. They hadn't left marks out there. Unless he had. Had he scrawled those words himself? In fits of delirium? His memories had gaps wide enough to swallow hours, days. Maybe he had walked out there before, left those messages, forgotten afterward. Or maybe the pulsar had reached into his mind, puppeteering him, puppeteering the ship, leaving its mark in human words. He pressed his palms to his eyes until stars danced in the dark. When he slept, the dreams worsened. He dreamt of walking the corridors, except they weren't broken, weren't frozen. The ship gleamed as it had on launch day. He heard footsteps behind him, turned, saw them all, Zhenya, Harlan, Lyra, the others, whole, alive, smiling. They beckoned. He followed, laughing with them, forgetting for a moment that he was alone. But then the walls warped, stretched, folded into infinite loops. The crew's eyes hollowed, their mouths stretched wider than faces should allow, and they chanted in unison, "Drift with us, drift forever." He woke screaming, sweat freezing on his skin. Anton began talking to himself more often, not to them, but to his own voice. It anchored him. "You're alive, you're Anton, you're still here." But the words from the debris echoed louder. "Still here, don't sleep, remember us." The drift continued. Systems continued to fail. Each day, or what felt like one, he wondered if he should stop patching, stop fighting. Just let the cold, the vacuum, the pulsar finish what they had started. The voices promised it would be easier. Still, his hands moved. Automatic, repairing seals, rationing breath. Survival wasn't a choice. It was reflex. And so the ship drifted. And so did he. Chapter 11. Ghost Logic. He awoke to laughter. Not the strained, brittle chuckles of exhausted crewmates trying to keep morale afloat, but something else raucous, grotesquely jubilant, echoing in the air ducts above him. It rose and fell in unnatural cadences, too fast for human lungs, too synchronized to belong to any individual throat. Hale sat up in the corridor, his head grazing a strip of dangling conduit. The emergency lights had dimmed further, pulsing at irregular intervals as though the ship itself were gasping. He checked his wrist display. Its surface was blank. He tapped, shook it, nothing. "Battery's gone," he muttered, voice hoarse. "Or time itself," said Mara's voice, soft as breath at his ear. He jerked around. Empty corridor. The laughter stopped. Instead, whispers crept in. Too many to isolate. Elias, Mara, Khan, Dr. Wren, all four, weaving in and out of each other like a single collective stream. Fragments of memory, orders, dying breaths. They spoke not to him, but through him, as if his skull were now the ship's amplifier. "Hull breach Sector 12. Seal it, seal it. I can't. This isn't the star we aimed for. Don't let me die in the dark." He staggered forward, palms grazing cold walls, slick with condensation. The pulsar outside the viewing slit strobed white fire. Every flash left after images that overlapped like multiple film frames out of sync. The ship wasn't one ship anymore. It was two, three, dozens, each fractionally out of phase, coexisting. He saw bulkheads where there should be doorways, hallways twisting into wrong geometries. He blinked, and they slid back into place, but not before carving a fresh scar across his sanity. He reached the mess hall. Chairs stood neatly in formation, as if waiting for a meal that never came. On the table, plates, forks, knives. He knew with a terrible certainty that they had been empty last time he looked. Now each plate bore a hunk of charred meat, steaming faintly, a smell of iron-rich blood filling the air. He couldn't breathe. "They didn't leave you," Elias whispered. "We're still eating together." Hale shoved the table. The plates scattered, clattering across the deck. The food dissolved into black ash before hitting the ground. No trace, no proof. He clawed his hair with trembling fingers. "What's happening to me?" "Not to you," said Mara. "Through you." He collapsed into a chair, chest heaving. Something was wrong with his memories. He had been piecing them together, convinced of their solidity, but the seams showed. He remembered Khan welding a breach shut, yet also remembered Khan floating out of the lock. Tethers snapped. Both memories bore equal weight. Both were true. Both were false. The ship was rewriting itself, rewriting him. Ghost logic. That was the term Wren had once joked about the way corrupted code in long-haul AIs built recursive nonsense loops. His brain was doing the same, a living processor caught in contradiction. He slapped his cheek, desperate for grounding. "Focus. Anchor yourself. You are—" The words jammed in his throat. Who was he? Hale, Mara coaxed. Commander Hale, but not only. Not anymore. The mess hall dissolved like mist, and suddenly he stood at the observation deck again. The pulsar loomed closer, impossibly close, surface storms boiling. But there was no glass between him and it, just vacuum. He should have died instantly, body shredded, eyes boiling. Instead, he breathed. The voices unified. "Join us." A new presence stirred. Different from the others. Not a memory of the crew, but something larger, woven from pulsar radiation and human thought. It pressed against the membrane of his mind, testing it, looking for seams to pry open. "Who are you?" Hale rasped. It did not answer in words. Instead, his memories rearranged again. Now he remembered being outside the ship when the blast hit. He remembered dying in the airlock. He remembered never leaving Earth. All memories, none of them real, yet all equally his. The entity fed themselves, lives, endings, each collapse of probability folded into the next. Hale fell to his knees, clawing at the deck. "Stop! Stop!" The ship groaned, metal twisting under unseen pressure. Somewhere, alarms triggered and died again. The vessel was becoming unstable, whether from physics or hallucination, he no longer knew. And the voices, still unified, whispered one last thing. "If you want truth, go to the core." He lay there long after, cheek against the cold deck, pulsar light flickering through the slits like the last strobe of existence. The laughter had not returned. Only silence. But silence, he realized, was worse. Chapter 12. Shattered Realities. Silence lay over the ship like a veil, but it was not empty silence. It was the silence of things watching. Kieran floated in the ruined corridor, his helmet off, hair drifting like pale filaments in the stale, motionless air. The pulsar's flare had passed, its brief, searing scream of radiation that had nearly gutted what remained of the vigilant dawn. Yet the aftershock lingered in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not in hull fractures, though those were plentiful, nor in the circuitry that still hissed and crackled when he tried to bridge power across the auxiliary grid. It lingered in his head. The voices. They were louder now, not a background static or a trickle of remembered phrases, but layered presences, awake and intrusive. "Kieran, don't go there. The bulkhead won't hold. He doesn't understand. He never did. You killed me, didn't you? Admit it. Don't leave us behind. Please." His fingers tightened on the cold rungs of the ladder, knuckles pale. He whispered, "You're not real." But the words had no power anymore. Even as he said them, he remembered Dahl's handwriting on a maintenance log, the loop of her letters, the way she had scrawled checklists in the margins when she was tired. He remembered Lieutenant Ochoa laughing at some private joke on the mess deck, tapping his knuckles on the table. He remembered with unwelcome clarity the way Ortega's body had looked when he first found it, mouth open, eyes clouded, fingers still curled as if grasping for something that was no longer there. These were not abstract memories anymore. They had detail, texture, emotional weight. If I can feel them, he thought, how unreal can they be? The ship creaked, a long groan that resonated through the structure. For a moment, he thought he heard breathing in it. The pulsar swept its beam again, an invisible lance this time outside the spectrum of his unaided eye. But its passage made the ship tremble, a vibration that seemed to shiver directly through his bones. His vision swam. The corridor blurred, doubled, fractured into two overlapping images of itself, one burned and ruined, the other intact, filled with shadowed figures walking past him. "Kieran," said a voice behind him. He froze. He turned slowly, though every muscle screamed not to. Doll stood there, or something, wearing her face. Her short cropped hair framed a pale face that should not have been there, not with the way her skull had been crushed against a collapsing bulkhead in engineering. She looked alive, bruised, yes, but breathing, blinking, her lips trembling. "You left me there," she said. Kieran's throat locked. "You're not real." Her eyes narrowed with something like pity. "Then why are you shaking?" He was. His hands trembled, his vision swam again. The corridor split once more. For a heartbeat he saw her broken body floating with the others. Then the intact doll again, regarding him with unbearable sadness. He fled. Not walking, shoving himself from rungs and handholds, half crawling, half floating, slamming into bulkheads, not caring if the impacts left bruises, anything to escape that impossible gaze. He reached the mess deck, or what was left of it. The long tables were overturned, trays and utensils scattered, some fused into the walls by bursts of radiation that had softened metal like wax. Except, again, it wasn't. The overlay persisted. In the flicker of failing light, he saw the mess deck as it had been, warm, alive, crew crowded around tables, Doll laughing, Ochoa singing badly out of tune, the smell of coffee and stale rations, someone swatting at music drifting faintly from the intercom. The ruined and the intact existed together, shifting with each pulse of the pulsar. His heart pounded. He pressed his palms to his eyes until bursts of light filled them. Shattered realities. That was the only phrase that came to him, and he did not know if it was his own thought or another voice planting it. The next time he heard Ortega, it wasn't in his head. It was through the intercom. "Bridge to engineering," came the voice, calm, level. Kieran froze. His pulse thundered. The intercom was dead. The ship's comms had been fried. He had checked. He had torn them apart with his own hands, seen the slagged wiring. "Bridge to engineering," the voice repeated. "Report status." He staggered to the nearest console. His fingers hovered, shaking. He forced himself to press the transmit key. His voice cracked. "Ortega's dead." Static hissed. Then, in the same steady tone, "Then who am I speaking to?" Kieran's stomach dropped into an abyss. Sleep offered no refuge. When exhaustion forced him to close his eyes, he dreamed of the pulsar. Its beam was an eye, unblinking, sweeping, fixing on him. Each time it passed, it peeled back layers of the ship, layers of himself, until nothing was left but a raw, exposed core screaming into the void. He woke, gasping, clutching the edge of his bunk. Except he wasn't in his bunk. He was in the medical bay, strapped to a table. His wrists were restrained. "Procedure commencing," said a voice overhead. He screamed, thrashing. The restraints cut into his skin. And then, blink, he was back in the bunk. No restraints. No table, just the taste of iron in his mouth from where he had bitten his tongue. The boundaries between memory, hallucination, and reality had dissolved. Kieran no longer trusted what his eyes told him, what his ears whispered. He moved through the ship like a ghost among ghosts, never sure if the corridor ahead would be broken steel and drifting ash, or alive with voices and movement. Sometimes he caught sight of himself. Not a reflection. He knew the difference. He saw himself standing at the far end of a hall, expression blank, hands red with blood. He saw himself at a console, calmly keying in commands he didn't recognize. Once, he glimpsed himself outside the viewport, floating in space, face pale and waxen, eyes wide and empty. When he blinked, those images vanished, but they lingered in his mind longer than they should have. He began speaking aloud, narrating his steps, just to tether himself. "I'm in Section C," he muttered. "Heading toward auxiliary control. I'm going to reroute power. I'm not dead. I'm not dreaming. I'm here." "For now," whispered Ochoa's voice. Kieran's laugh cracked into something close to sobbing. The pulsar's light swept again, rattling the ship. The overlay surged. For a moment, everything was whole. The crew was alive, eating, talking, working. The ship was unbroken, and Kieran was among them, not alone, not fractured. He almost let himself believe. He almost reached out. Then the pulse passed, and everything was ash again. He knew now that whatever the truth was, he couldn't postpone it much longer. The ship was failing. His mind was failing faster. If he didn't anchor himself soon, there would be nothing left to anchor. But anchor to what? The ship? A corpse orbiting a star that cared nothing for them. The crew, dead, yet alive in his head, fragmenting him further. Himself? He wasn't sure there was a singular himself anymore. He sat in the ruined mess deck, hands clasped until his knuckles hurt, whispering into the dark. "Tell me what's real." No one answered, or maybe everyone did. Chapter 13. The Threshold. The pulsar flared again, a stuttering lighthouse of annihilation. Its beam carved through the black, dragging shadows across the ship's ruined bulkheads. Cade blinked against the residual glow, his eyes raw. The blood vessels in them burst long ago from overexposure and strain. Every flash seemed to sear deeper into his skull, painting the dead crew onto the walls, their faces warped, stretched, and half-burned into memory. He stood at the junction outside the reactor chamber, suit cracked at one shoulder, his breath shallow against the thin pressure the emergency systems could still maintain. He could hear the ship's frame creaking, the distant metal fatigue groaning like whale song, like something enormous turning in its sleep. The voices inside him had grown quiet, too quiet. "Why now?" Cade whispered, hand pressed against the wall. His fingertips brushed frost forming on the bulkhead. "You always said something. Orders, arguments, pleas, now nothing." No reply. But when the pulsar flared again, he swore he saw them. Just at the edge of his vision, Dr. Halloran with her crooked glasses, Singh with his constant frown, Morales with his easy grin. Flickering, ghosts caught between the flash and the dark. Cade moved forward. The gravity here was inconsistent, the ship's artificial spin faltering after too many months, or years, adrift. Every step was a cautious slide, boots gripping the deck with magnetic seals. His oxygen gauge dipped again, needle trembling at the red. 5 minutes of air. That was the reality, the hard, unnegotiable number. He reached the reactor door. It hung slightly ajar, warped by stress fractures. Beyond was the threshold, the heart of the ship, and the place where answers waited, or oblivion. He hesitated. His mind drifted back to the first time he'd woken, strapped in the med bay with his head pounding, his memories fractured. The voices had been loud then, deafening, a chorus of half-truths. Now they had funneled him here, toward the reactor, toward a decision. The door rasped as he forced it wider. Inside, the reactor chamber was a cathedral of ruin. Blackened conduits ran like ribs, shattered coolant pipes spilling glittering frost into the weightless air. In the center, a fusion sphere pulsed erratically, damaged shielding leaking threads of blue radiation that made the air itself shimmer. It should have killed him instantly, but the ship was long past normal physics. Time and decay bent into strange loops under the pulsar's influence. On the far side of the chamber, Mounted like some grotesque idol was the ship's black box array. Its casing was cracked open, wires spilling like entrails, and above it, etched into the bulkhead with something sharp, were words. His words. Not enough. Cade's breath caught. He stumbled closer, legs trembling. His reflection warped in the fusion sphere's glow, gaunt, eyes sunken, lips cracked. A dying man. He touched the scratched words, and suddenly, the silence broke. Voices cascaded back, overlapping, shattering the fragile quiet. You left us. No, we chose. Don't listen, listen, listen. We can't all go. Someone had to stay. You promised. The chamber tilted in his vision. He grabbed the railing, holding himself steady as the voices screamed through him. He saw flashes, Halloran rerouting power, Singh sealing off compartments, Morales laughing bitterly as the reactor alarms went wild, and himself at the center of it all, making decisions that led here. He had been the one. He had ordered the lockdown. He had consigned them to die to preserve the black box, the data, the record of what had happened. And then he had tried to erase it from himself, to bury the guilt, to carve the words, "not enough," as both confession and warning. The reactor pulsed again, shedding a veil of light across him. His air gauge buzzed, needles scraping the final tick. Cade. It wasn't just in his head this time. The voice was real, or close enough to real that he couldn't separate it. Halloran's voice, calm, deliberate. The box still works. Send it. Send the truth. Then Singh, overlapping her, sharp and urgent. Seal it. Destroy it. Don't let anyone find what we became. Then Morales, with his half-broken chuckle. Or you can stop fighting, hermano. Join us. No more choices. No more guilt. The reactor shuddered, dimmed, then surged. Radiation alarms screamed into the chamber. His helmet display fuzzed into static. Cade dragged himself forward, chest heaving. He reached the black box. His gloves shook as he braced on its cracked housing. The interface flickered weakly. Waiting, waiting. 3 choices. Transmit, erase, join them. His heart pounded. His lungs clawed for air. He thought of Earth, distant and blurred, maybe long dead, maybe still waiting. He thought of the voices that had filled his head, and the silence that might come after. The pulsar's beam swept across the chamber one last time, brilliant and blinding. His fingers hovered over the cracked console. And then...
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay safe.